Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex. And so who or what is Null? This is what I want to try to answer in today's video. I want to go through a brief history of Null and then the symbiotes, and then leave you guys with some reading recommendations and some more if you guys want to really explore the history of this character who is not even that old, and that's the greatest part about it. So before we get started, of course, huge spoilers for Venom from 2018. This came out in July 2018. I think the run has finished. It's, I think, 25 issues. Donny Cates again writing for Venom. But yeah, it's about 2 years old now. So if you haven't checked it out, check it out if you want to find out all about Null. But basically, in the third issue of Venom 2018, we see Null for the very first time coming out of the body of a gigantic symbiote dragon. Yeah. And it connects to issues as far back as 2013. It connects to fairy tales and tales of, you know, mythology that we know about. And then it also greatly expands Null's history, and Null's existence in the universe greatly expands what we know and what the symbiotes are capable of. So we're going to dive into all of that with this video. So here we go. This is Null right here. He's got Miles Morales sort of held hostage, so to speak, and he's talking to Venom Eddie Brock. So this is sort of where we pick up. But that's not actually where we first know about the symbiote, right? We know of the symbiote, at least if you've watched the movies, if you've watched as a more casual Marvel fan, if you've watched the Spider-Man animated series, you remember that Spider-Man Peter Parker is the one who originally comes into contact with the symbiote. It came from somewhere in space, right? They captured it in space at the space station, and then they were bringing it back to Earth, and then it got loose, and then it bonded to Peter Parker because it was looking for a host. But that's not actually where symbiotes started. The symbiote actually has a crazy history that goes back way further than that. So basically, I'm not going to give you guys the exact details because I don't want to ruin the story completely, and I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. But essentially what happens is Eddie Brock, right, Venom, he finds out in this issue, in this 2018 storyline, he finds out that the SHIELD and the government were using the symbiote that they found back in the Vietnam War. So back in the 60s and 70s, they were using that to create like super soldiers a la Captain America. They were getting them bonded to this symbiote, and then they were using them to fight in the Vietnam War. And then they eventually can't control the soldiers anymore because they all go crazy. They all get this, like, you know, rage, and so they have to freeze them. And they put them on ice. But then in 2000 and whenever the story takes place, they're going to eliminate them. So somebody reaches out to Venom Eddie Brock and asks Venom to save these symbiotes. Well, what happens is these symbiotes come out and they look like the symbiotes that you've seen recently with the really big squiggly line in their face, and they look, you know, more menacing, and they don't really have eyes. They just have a mouth, and they form this dragon. And this it's sort of like a smaller dragon, takes off into the sky at night. And so this leads to both Eddie Brock and Miles Morales. At first, Miles Morales attacks Eddie, but then they team up to fight this gigantic symbiote dragon. And this is taking place in the present. But where Null comes in is that basically Miles Morales, they plan it on purpose. Miles Morales gets swallowed up by the dragon, by this dragon symbiote who we'll call Grendel, okay? And then he releases all of his Venom blast energy simultaneously, and that's what takes down this gigantic symbiote dragon. But then in the process, someone creeps out, and that, of course, is Null. But Null's not actually there. Null is just controlling the gigantic dragon symbiote remotely. Null is millions of light years or thousands of light years away on Clintar. So we'll find out more about that. So now we find out more about Null because he basically educates Venom on the truth of Clintar, the truth of the symbiotes, the truth of Null, the symbiote god. So these are those sort of swirly-eyed things that I was talking to you guys about, where basically these are sort of like berserk symbiotes that don't have a mind, they don't have compassion or empathy or humanity. They're just killing machines. But just to show you guys briefly how strong Null is, he just points his hand at Eddie Brock and he immediately knocks all of the symbiote out of him. he is 100% untouchable by other symbiotes. That's how strong Null is. So crazy, right? So he goes into this story mode. It's sort of like it reminds me of Shakespeare when he's you doing that soliloquy to the when Hamlet's doing the soliloquy to the skull, to be or not to be. That is the question. So he grabs that's the Venom symbiote. Okay, he grabs the Venom symbiote while he's talking, and he wants to purge the Venom symbiote of humanity, because Null says that the symbiote, which should be aggressive and ravenous and chaotic, has been infected by humanity's light. And Null is all about the darkness, so he wants to take that out of Venom. So he basically tries to do that. He wants to burn it out of Venom, and Eddie doesn't really like that. And then Null introduces himself in a way that we recognize him better, with the gigantic teeth and the long tongue. So then he shows him through this connection about his life as the Lord of the Abyss. So we go back billions of years to where Null first started. And so Null basically starts off floating in nothingness, in the darkness, and the darkness was his world. He was chilling in the darkness. But then the Celestials show up with this burst of energy, this burst of light, and they start creating things. These are the Celestials that we have the CTPs based on. That's the CTP of refinement, that's the CTP of energy, and so on and so forth. So that's the CTP of regen, I believe. So the Celestials start creating life. They start creating worlds. Like, the Celestials are super powerful, right? But of course, they're creating this stuff, and they're creating all this light, which takes away from Null's universe. It takes away from Null's space. He wants the darkness. He's the Dark Lord, right? He's like Voldemort or whatever. So what does Null do? He creates, in the void, he creates the Necro Sword, the all black, out of the abyss. He creates that, and he chops the Celestial's head off. He kills a Celestial in one hit. That's how strong Null is. But again, this is billions of years ago. So what do the other Celestials do? They turn and they banish Null to another void. They basically push him thousands of light years away. But of course, that's where he wants to be. He wants to be in the darkness. So they basically power him up and give him time to do his work. So he basically creates a world, so to speak, within the skull, within the head of the Celestial. And you can see sort of like a blacksmith here, biding his time, using this abyss, the darkness basically that he created, the symbiote that he created, the sword. He forges it. He wants to forge it into a real sword. So he does this. Fun fact, by the way, this head ends up becoming Nowhere, that planet that we see in all those Avengers movies. So anyways, the really interesting thing here thematically is, what is he doing as a blacksmith to this piece of symbiote? He is heating it up, and then he's banging it and making a lot of noise. So this is where the first symbiotes, and he mentions this in the text, but this is where the first symbiotes get their two primary weaknesses: to fire and to sound. It was the forging process of the Necro Sword. How cool is that? I love that. I really love that little bit, that little tidbit that sort of tied it all in. It didn't really make sense. Like, why are symbiotes specifically weak? They might be weak to some other things as well, like lightning, which we'll see why in a little bit. But specifically and extensively, they're weak to, and almost all of them are weak to both sound and fire. But now we know why, because Null was busy building the very first symbiote out of his own abyss and out of his anger for, having his world invaded, having his space invaded by the Celestials and by the light, right? So anyways, he takes the sword and he goes on a crusade to just kill all the gods. He just wants to kill everyone, because basically the universe has just started becoming a thing. And so there's not many people out there. There's not many things out there. There's just mostly gods creating stuff. So he wants to go and just murder them all because he wants the darkness back. Okay, cool. So he goes around murdering, and he ends up losing, or at least being damaged, hurt enough to fall down to a planet when he's fighting one of these gold-colored gods. And someone takes his sword from him. So he loses his sword. I'm going to quickly jump to a comic book from 2013. This is about Gore the God Butcher, who is one of Thor's greatest enemies. So here on this planet, this is sort of like Gore's history and his origins. Again, I'm sort of spoiling this, but again, this is from 2013. So Gore gets... he basically gets banished from his clan, from his group of people, because he stopped believing in gods. And he stopped believing in gods because a bunch of bad stuff happened to him. His wife died, his mother died, his kids, I think, died. He just had a really bad life. So he's gonna die, basically. He's left alone. He's abandoned in the desert, on this desert planet. He's an alien, whatever. But then he sees this explosion, and of course the explosion is Null and another god fighting. So he goes to inspect the rubble and the crash, and he sees them there, just like we saw in that image where is it? Over here. Yeah. So this one right here, right? This is 2013. So they're referencing this 5 years later. So what happens? Gore, the God Butcher, gets upset at these gods who never listened, who never tried to save him, who never tried to save his family. And the god says, help me, like I'm trying to fight Null here. But of course, Gore has no idea, so he takes the All Black and he murders the god. And then he basically uses the symbiote and morphs into a suit and then dips to space to find more gods and become Gore, the God Butcher. And then of course he meets Thor and they fight, right? Thor is a god, yada yada yada. So that's what happens to Null. But then Null gets his powers back eventually, like he recovers. He's on this planet and he finds out that he can now use this abyss to infect other living beings, lesser creatures he calls them. And then he can turn them into these flying symbiotes, into these other symbiotes, and he learns that he can use this symbiosis to basically gather more information, because whatever they see, he can see, and what they do, he can control. So he basically creates an army of these symbiotes, and that's what happens. And he has this sort of his horde of these sort of swirly-eyed creatures. And then he creates this gigantic dragon who goes from world to world destroying the light, all right, and just creating more darkness. And this gigantic dragon eventually gets to Earth, this dragon that we call Grendel. And then who defeats the Grendel in classic mythology? Well, it's Beowulf, right? But there's no Beowulf in Marvel. Well, maybe there is, but it wasn't Beowulf. It was Thor, baby. So Thor comes swinging in with his lightning, and he cracks this Grendel, and he severs the connection. He breaks the connection off. So basically, Thor put Null in the position that he's in now, and I'll explain why. So Thor breaks this connection between Null and this gigantic symbiote dragon. And what that does is it turns the symbiote dragon into thousands of smaller symbiotes. They just unravel and they spread out. But then what happens, like the same thing that happened to Venom and to other symbiotes, is that the symbiote wants to find a compatible host. And when they find a compatible host, they sort of take on character traits of each other. So the Venom symbiote, right, when it was with Peter Parker, it made him more evil and more aggressive. But when it's with Venom, although he's aggressive at first, he eventually tames the symbiote and he learns to control it. And Venom sort of becomes a good guy, right? And so that's what happens to the symbiotes, is they sort of become good guys in a way. They get sort of infected by the light, as Null calls it. But they don't really want to listen to Null anymore because they found new hosts. They don't have to do what Null says anymore. They can do what their host wants, right? These newly freed symbiotes. So what happens? The symbiotes go back to Null and they revolt. And they're like, you know what? We don't want to listen to you anymore. So they trap Null inside of their own swirling mass. Thousands, millions of symbiotes basically trapping Null inside of themselves, with Null in the center. And this is really good drawings. And so essentially, Clintar is the symbiote word for cage. Clintar is not a planet. It's a living cage of thousands of symbiotes gathered together, constantly moving and shifting to hold Null in the center, to keep him trapped so that he cannot control them and enslave them. How insane is this? So anyways, that's Null. That's who Null is. How awesome is that? So anywho, cut to 2018, cut to the present. Miles Morales and Venom realize that the whole time that Null's been talking to them, Null has basically sucked them back into the dragon, and they're now flying away on the inside this dragon. So yeah, they're inside the dragon. And so Miles Morales makes a decision, and he's like, yo, Eddie, we got to get out of here. It's either we stay in here or we dip. So they start falling from the sky. And this is where we pick up in the comics, where the symbiote, now having the Venom symbiote that belongs to Eddie Brock, now having interacted with Null, now having felt some of Null's power, again, he's gotten a closer connection to the primordial, the very first, he's not even a symbiote really, but he's the symbiote god, right? Null, having had that connection, it made him stronger. to the point where he tells Eddie, let me just grow some wings. And he learns these new powers because of his connection to Null. So this is just so freaking cool. So amazing. It's incredible. Now, you're probably wondering where Absolute Carnage comes into play. Carnage basically is tasked. Carnage worships Null. Unlike Venom and unlike other symbiotes, Carnage worships Null. And basically what Carnage ends up deciding to do in the comics, in Absolute Carnage and beyond, is he ends up saying, you know what, we're going to bring Null back. And so he goes on a journey to collect symbiote information, codexes, in order to unseal, in order to release Null from the Clintar prison, so that he can rule once again and then spread darkness across the universe. So that is Null. That is why we have a flying symbiote sword wielding Venom Eddie Brock. And that is maybe a taste of what we can expect. Hopefully we will fight on Clintar, despite the fact that it's not actually a planet. Well, it is and it isn't a planet. But yeah, hopefully we'll see that in Marvel Future Fight in the update. Hopefully they will accurately reflect Null's power, because he's insanely strong. I had no idea he was strong. I had a blast reading this comic. It's really well written. The drawing is amazing. Once again, Donnie and Co. Really knock it out of the park. And I strongly recommend that you read it. It's Venom from 2018. You start on issue 1, and by the 3rd issue, you're just running. You're running through all this Null stuff, and then it's only going to get better from there, and then that will snowball into Absolute Carnage and the more recent stuff with Scream, and then, you know, the King in Black, which is what's coming later this year. So catch up now. I'll be doing the same, and let me know down below in the comments what you think of Null and the symbiote history basically being rewritten and expanded way past its previous borders. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.